Hello there, and welcome to the map screen, where we take a look at the design and function of maps in video games through a cartographic lens. In this video, we'll be looking at an all-time classic, Super Metroid. Released in 1994 for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Metroid marked the third entry in the Metroid series, following the continuing adventures of galactic bounty hunter Samus Aran, saving the galaxy from the likes of space pirates, space parasites, and the life-draining jellyfish with teeth known as Metroids. It was a landmark title, and even today, 30 years after its initial release, Super Metroid remains a common contender at the top of many greatest of all time lists. Alongside the Castlevania series, it helped to foster an entire subgenre of video games known creatively as Metroidvanias. One of the hallmarks of this style of game includes a lock and key style progression system through maze-like worlds that are designed to loop back on themselves. Players can discover different items and abilities that allow them access to new parts of the map or shortcuts to and secrets within previously explored areas. Games like Hollow Knight, Guacamelee, and the Ori series fit directly into this subgenre, but these ideas have become so prevalent that they can now be found across the entire action-adventure genre with games like Batman Arkham Asylum, Star Wars, Jedi Survivor, and even the modern Tomb Raider trilogy, among many others, all taking heavy inspiration from Metroid's progression structure. And of course, each one of those games makes use of an in-game map to help players navigate their way through the world. So, what inspired the introduction of an in-game map to the Metroid series? The original Metroid, released for the Nintendo Entertainment System between 1986 and 1988, depending where you lived, was a novel take on the 2D action platformer with its non-linear world structure. Players were given an almost overwhelming amount of freedom in how they went about exploring the subterranean caverns of Planet Zebes. Compared with most other side-scrolling games at the time, titles like Super Mario Bros. Or Mega Man, which nearly always expected players to progress towards the right side of the screen, Metroid required you to explore in all directions, and even return to past areas where previously locked doors and obstacles could be accessed using new abilities found throughout the journey. The system rewarded curiosity and a good memory, but it could also be difficult to navigate with the maze-like structure of the level design. There was no in-game map, and the instruction booklet contained only a generalized diagram of how the different sections of Planet Zebes connected. So players who wanted or needed a full map either had to find a copy of Nintendo Power Magazine, the official Nintendo Player's Guide, or sketch out one of their own. And while there is a certain level of satisfaction that comes with drawing your own map on paper, which some players no doubt enjoyed, it made the game inaccessible or unnecessarily difficult for others. However, it's not entirely true to say that there was no in-game map in the original Metroid. At least, there wasn't one in the version that 99% of people played. In a fun bit of Nintendo trivia, there was actually an arcade cabinet that Nintendo released called the Play Choice 10, essentially a coin-operated NES console which, in an odd foreshadowing to the Nintendo DS, featured a second display above its main screen. And there was a special version of the original Metroid in this cabinet that included a primitive map to help guide the player between different areas of the world, and even showed the general location of power-ups. But while neat, it was really only a small improvement over the illustrated version found in the game's instruction booklet. The next entry in the series, Metroid 2: Return of Samus, released for the Game Boy in 1991, and was also a challenge for players to navigate. While the world design was more linear than the previous game, the limitations of the Game Boy hardware meant that there was less visual variety in the environments, making it even more difficult to tell one area apart from the other. Players would again have to rely on an issue of Nintendo Power or their own sketches and notes if they didn't want to fumble around through trial and error. Like the first game, the instruction booklet also had a map inside of it, but it wasn't terribly accurate and it only covered a small area at the beginning of the game just to help players get going. So then came Super Metroid, and with it, the introduction of an in-game map as a major new gameplay feature. It was a huge quality of life improvement, helping to alleviate a lot of the frustrations of backtracking through previous areas and allowing players to focus more on the fun part of exploration, discovering the undiscovered. So let's actually take a look at the map itself. At first glance, it might appear a bit simple, even primitive. It's grid-based with lots of straight lines and minimal symbols and colors. And while some of that look is no doubt due to the hardware limitations of the time, it also keeps in theme of some of the retro-future kind of sci-fi influences of the 1980s that inspired the Metroid series. Things like the vector computer displays found aboard the Nostromo in the film Alien, which was a huge influence on the series. It's also similar to things like the displays seen in Star Wars, like the X-Wing targeting computer, or the huge NORAD map displays seen in movies like War Games. At the time, these were futuristic looking, and the Super Metroid map wanted to look futuristic too. The gridded nature of the map keeps it in a consistent scale with the world that players navigate, allowing them to accurately judge distances between areas, much like we would in real life using a road map. Compare that with something like the illustrated map found in the Super Metroid instruction booklet, which wasn't designed to help the player navigate so much as it was to spark their imagination and get them excited for the journey ahead. Unlike a road map, however, is the map's orientation. Through many reasons outside of the scope of this video, including magnetic poles and various geopolitical influences, north on top has long been the sort of de facto orientation for maps, and most use a sort of bird's eye view looking directly down at the ground from above. But a map is always oriented to whatever best suits its function. In the case of Super Metroid, we're not looking down at the world so much as we're getting a profile view from the side, which is in the same orientation and view that we control Samus in, the up direction toward the planet's surface being at the top of the screen. It's something most players won't even think about and is almost too obvious to even be worth mentioning, but it is something not commonly seen outside of video games. In the real world, you might find it on maps focusing on spaces with a lot of verticality, map-adjacent things like architecture drawings or geologic profiles. The colors on this map reveal where the player has and has not been. Bright pink highlights previously explored areas and is at the top of the map's visual hierarchy, while dark blue shows places that are known but unvisited, usually unlocked by way of map rooms scattered across the world. These map rooms can be ignored if the players choose, or inadvertently missed, but they help place the in-game map directly into the lore of the world itself. Compare that with some of the other types of information often provided to players in video games, like floating damage numbers, aiming reticules, pop-up hint boxes, or life and coin counts, which don't exist within the world of the game itself, but are there solely for the player's benefit. But here we could believe that Samus is actually downloading and using these sections of the map, and as later games in the series show, viewing them from within her suit's visor. It's these sort of things that can really help to build immersion in a game world, and is something that Metroid excels at. In between finding map rooms, which only reveal small sections of the game world, players can also unveil parts of the map simply by visiting those places, driven by a feature called auto-mapping. While Super Metroid wasn't the first game to use auto-mapping, it was certainly one of the strongest early iterations of the idea. It took that concept of drawing out your own map on pencil and paper as you went, and did it for you. And by using this feature to slowly unveil the map, rather than showing the entire game world from the start, it preserved that sense of discovery, as well as a bit of the anxiety and dread of the unknown that helps give Metroid the strong sense of isolation that it's known for. Also note how the dark blue showing the unexplored areas is much closer to the black background of the unknown. This is a common design technique which helps to associate two similar objects or ideas using colors with similar values or hues, or similar symbols like using capital letters to show special rooms, which help the player know that these two things are similar to one another. More on symbols, there are a few different ones here to mark various points of interest. Rooms with a big letter S mark save rooms to save your progress, while rooms with an M are those previously mentioned map rooms. There's no legend on the map to explain any of this, but it doesn't need to. Players will quickly understand what those symbols mean the first time they visit one of those rooms, though there is technically a map legend in the instruction booklet should the player want it. The most common symbol on the map are the small white dots representing the location of hidden items and upgrades for Samus to collect. There are also markers for boss locations, missile and energy refill stations, and of course the position of Samus herself. Later games in the series would expand and improve on some of the shortcomings of Super Metroid's map by providing even more helpful information, including the location and types of locked doors that players came across. For example, red doors, which could only be opened with a missile upgrade. In addition to the map screen, which players could access from within the start menu, there was technically a second in-game map within Super Metroid. When players load up a save file, they're shown a quick animation along with a small-scale map of Planet Zebes, highlighting what section of the world they were about to load into. The design uses a hexagonal grid and is interesting to look at, although it appears to have the illusion of more detail than there really is. Some of the hexagons are taller or shorter than others, which gives the impression of varying elevations or depths, but they don't appear to have any real connection to the layout that players traverse. But it's a cool looking map and helps to set the tone, and again contributes to player immersion, giving the world a sense of scale. This hexagonal grid design would also later return in the sequel, Metroid Prime, but that's a map for another video. But perhaps the most useful feature of the map in Super Metroid is its extension into a mini-map, which players can see from the corner of the main screen during gameplay without needing to pause their game. It's essentially a cropped version of the full map that remains centered on the player, letting them see what is in Samus's immediate area without having to constantly interrupt gameplay. This keeps the pace brisk. It means that players only need to check the big map whenever they're plotting out longer routes across the world. Nowadays, you can find, and might even come to expect, this sort of thing in countless games that require navigation, but at the time, it was quite groundbreaking. So what do you think of the map in Super Metroid? Was it a welcome quality of life improvement, or do you feel like it might have stifled your potential career as a cartographer? What other in-game maps around this era did you appreciate? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.